When everyone else's home is being attacked because it is a house of worship, we have to recognize that we're not the first or the last to suffer. And so reaching out beyond our walls to other communities to say, this is not perpetrated in my name. This is not my understanding of religion, whatever my religion might be.
There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the Spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all of our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. Thus said the ghost of Christmas Present to Ebenezer Scrooge in Charles Dickens' immortal Christmas Carol. See, Dickens understood something. Terrible things are often done in this world in the name of religions, but they're really done by people advancing their own worldly power and ambition, using religion to justify that. Religion doesn't have to be a divisive force in our community. It can actually bring us together because religions ultimately tell us we must serve something higher than ourselves. We recently spoke with 3 prominent San Diego religious leaders about the role of religion in building community. Bishop Brown Snook, Rabbi Ridberg, and Imam Hassane, I want to thank you for being with us tonight for our Keep It Civil San Diego program. What we're talking about tonight is ecumenical civility. Religion has been, across history, often a divisive force, particularly for peoples of the book, particularly in Western civilization. How do you work to get around that? How do we turn religion into the real unifying force that it can be to build more common senses of community, of civility?
I think that in San Diego, we do many things together. We do many kind of interfaith ministries. We identify values that we share in common, and we find things that we can do together to help the community around us. So, for instance, the Episcopal Church, which I'm the bishop of, works closely with Jewish Family Services, with Catholic Charities, to work on border and migration issues. We work on an interfaith basis with homeless people and other issues facing our community, which I think is a way that we can identify those common values that we share, all 3 Abrahamic faiths. We share love for our community and the desire to do good things in our community and make it a better world.
Yeah, and homelessness, problems of immigration, problems of children does not respect any particular religion per se. Rabbi Ridberg, what is your work with ecumenical bridge building, as it were?
Well, I think, first of all of us can speak to the general dichotomy that religion is, on one hand, the source of a lot of, as you say, violence, consternation, anger, but it's also the greatest balm, in a sense, where compassion and where justice seeking and where love of neighbor resides. So the question is how you balance, or actually shift the balance away from the tendencies toward extremism and chauvinism within a religious tradition, and to point to all of the texts and all of the traditions and all of the teachings about what it is to be a human being. That all of us are human beings created in the image of the divine, and that's what we need to see when we look at each other before we see, the collar, the head covering, the shawl, whatever it is. But this is a child of God.
And that's always the perplexing issue. I mean, in Christianity, the founder said, turn the other cheek. I mean, Islam, Imam Hassane, is based on surrender, faith to God. You give up yourself for something higher. I mean, how do you get that message across and avoid, as Rabbi Ridberg was saying, the problems of people using religion as a club to club down others to build their own sense of self?
Exactly. Whenever I go and look at different religions, or I hear representatives of different religions speak about their own faith and talk about the values and the principles, that their religions teach, I can say that all these religions are supposed to be a force of establishing goodness in the community. But unfortunately, I strongly believe that throughout all religions of the world, there were people who hijacked their own religions, who unfortunately misunderstood the essence and the spirit of their faiths, and they took things to the extreme, and they started using or misusing their own religion to attack others and to develop this feeling or sense of superiority that we are better than you. And this is how they started dehumanizing people and spreading corruption in the society and all that stuff, to the point that made a lot of people, as you have mentioned at the beginning, thinking that every type of evil that exists comes from these religions. And I don't believe that religions create corruption in the society. I believe that all the religions teach goodness and try to make people act in the best way possible.
And the way we approach civility in our movement and our program is that civility is all about like ohana. It's family. It's no one's left behind or forgotten. And I think that's what religion at its best is trying to offer us, that there is something beyond ourselves that we have to serve. How is that message getting so garbled for a lot of people who don't want to belong to a religion because they see all the bad stuff that happens with it, and for people, like you mentioned, who seem to want to hijack it for secular political purposes?
I think you're right about religion getting hijacked. And the problem with any group of people is that if we start using our group, whatever group it is, to enhance our own power, then it can be misused. And so in some cases, that's what's happened with religion. It has been misused for purposes it wasn't intended for. And so I think for us as religious leaders, what we are called to do is really help our people live more deeply into our own tradition and understand that all people are created in the image of God, and that all people are beloved by God, all creation is holy. And it is not a tenet of our religion to be better than anyone else. It is, in fact, we are called to love our neighbor. And we are called to honor and respect difference, and to honor and respect all people.
But that doesn't always seem to play out as much as we'd like. How are you working at doing things like that in San Diego to get it from the sermon, from the discussion, into the world so that people actually can live that?
Well, part of the challenge, I think, in this moment is that in a cultural way, there's so much divisiveness that is separate from religious tradition, and so people have a choice, right, where they're going to go to get their solace from the divisiveness outside of the world, and then they come into their community, and they want that community to be the place where they can feel at home. But when everyone else's home is being attacked because it is a house of worship, and every faith tradition in the last few years has had a horrific murder and really massacre in churches, in synagogues, in mosques all over the world. So we simultaneously, and in San Diego too, of course, last year at Poway. So we simultaneously turn inward to our own community because we want to feel connected to ourselves. And at the same time, we have to recognize that we're not the first or the last to suffer. And so reaching out beyond our walls to other communities in San Diego proper, but also all over the world, to say, this is not perpetrated in my name. This is not my understanding of religion, whatever my religion might be. And that's critical, because if we only see for ourselves as the case of a terminal uniqueness, right? We're the only ones who have suffered, or we're the only ones who are dealing with this, but we don't see the camaraderie, unfortunately, in the suffering across all lines that divide. We are missing an opportunity to be aligned in face of a common enemy, which is hatred and xenophobia.
And as you say that becomes an issue. You see the bad things happening out there, you fall into your own faith community, but then comfort can become walls, and you exclude others, and you lose that sense of connectivity. Imam Hassane, how do you deal with that, to try to both maintain a sense of community, but then the broader community with people of other faiths and non-religious, which is one of the fastest growing segments of our society. How do we bridge those divides?
I believe that religious leaders have a huge responsibility towards not only their own communities, but towards the larger society. And I often say that what we as clergy and faith leaders say from the mimbar, from the bima, from the pulpit matters. The words that we say, the way we preach our own faith to our own communities will make the difference. So we have to feel this responsibility, and we have to be very careful how to portray our faith, how to preach our faith. I personally believe, and this is based on my humble experience, that when I reach out to other faith traditions and I start working with them through the interfaith dialogue and the interfaith work based on whatever cause, social justice, immigration, refugees, climate justice, I believe that this helped me to serve my community better. It's not about just caring for my own community inside that building that is called the Islamic Center of San Diego, but also it's about connecting my community with other faith-based communities and find out ways and means how we can work together. I believe this is the way we can survive peacefully, and we can establish a society where people of different faiths and different cultures can show respect to one another.
Do you have examples of projects you've worked on that have achieved that end, or the opposite, maybe some things that have fallen short, where you've identified barriers that you're still trying to breach, to bring down?
Well, so with all of the tragedies that have befallen our country and the world in the last few years, unfortunately, we find comfort in the aftermath of tragedy, right? And I mean, I don't want to say unfortunately. Fortunately, we find comfort in the aftermath of tragedy. Unfortunately, it takes tragedy often to bring us all together. And certainly after the massacre in Pittsburgh, when 3,000 people came to stand with the Jewish community, and it was an incredibly warm and wonderful outpouring of support in a sense that we weren't alone. And after the massacre in New Zealand, and when we gathered in Balboa Park and we stood together once again, because we are all suffering the same fate in that way. I think that is where we come together easily because we are in shared suffering. The question of how we come together to share not just our faiths for educational purposes, but also to work together in the positive to repair the world, I think is a growing edge for all of us. I mean, we're all sort of insulated in our own communities, what we need to do for our own people, and how we branch out and say, hey, let's do this together because we share a common interest, I think is a growing edge in communities all over the country who want to do the interfaith justice work and who see that as a natural place of connection, but also wonder, well, how can we share in some spiritual, educational sense as well would be an important edge to grow.
We're coming closer to the Martin Luther King Day, and locally here in San Diego for several years, the Islamic Center of San Diego, Beth Israel Congregation, and also the First Methodist Church in Mission Valley, we started what we call a day of service. It's a day on, not day off, and doing a community service, basically going to Balboa Park on that day and bringing people from our 3 congregations and engage them in working together. And now I believe it's 20 plus congregations that are joining every year. And the next one will be in Monday, January the 20th. Also, when it comes to feeding the homeless, the Islamic Center of San Diego every year during the rotational shelter that is under the Interfaith Shelter Network based on the Catholic Diocese of San Diego, we team up in the Claremont area with several churches where the homeless are sheltered, and my congregation provide dinner, provide overnight volunteers. This is the kind of work that is needed between our congregations and our faith traditions right here locally in San Diego, that will allow people from every faith tradition not only to know one another, but to start working together for a noble cause.
And I mentioned already the issue of border and migration ministries. So Jewish Family Services and some other groups in the city of San Diego have been very involved in migrants who, for instance, were in this country, released from custody, nowhere to go, no food, no water, that sort of thing. And so our church has helped with that in conjunction with other faith groups. And in a bigger sense, I think it is the responsibility of every congregation, and I've urged all of my congregations to be involved in their neighborhood, to go out into their neighborhood, to discover who is there, to identify community partners, religious groups, nonprofit groups, other groups who are concerned about their community, and really try to understand how we can make a difference in that neighborhood. And so, for instance, we have a church, St. Luke's in North Park, works closely with the International Rescue Committee doing refugee work. And so the International Rescue Committee does gardening, teaches people to do urban farming, teaches people to cook and so forth, so that they can develop a livelihood on their own. That's an example of working with a nonprofit community partner. But we do many projects, interfaith and ecumenical, because together we can make more of a difference than we can alone.
Yeah, the hour in the seats isn't quite as good as the day in the streets, as it were, to get out into the community. And how does that help with outreach to younger generations that want to become more empowered in changing the world?
I think it does. I think it does. One of the challenges, I think, that on the one hand, this up-and-coming generation sees religion in this way of extremism and violence, and then they go to their local house of worship, and perhaps it's a little bit boring, right? Or it's a little bit staid, and the faith or the tradition itself doesn't speak to them. It's become somewhat flat. And so they're caught between this religious extremism on one side and this like incredibly dull sense of a spiritual life on the other. And so I often see my job as really pushing away those extremes and saying, no, there is meaning to be had in communal life, religious communal life. There are teachings to inspire you, and there's also what to push against, to say, no, this is not how we're going to be now. We're going to raise our faith tradition to new heights, whichever it is. And I look across the country at colleagues who are wrestling with this very question, because for the younger generation who perhaps don't have this sort of instant attachment to religious community, but they have to be sold on it, right? You have to sort of sell it and make sure that it's worth their time. You want it to be meaningful, you want it to be powerful, and you want it to inspire them to take it out of the house of worship and to go out into the streets and to do the work that the tradition teaches is how you transform the world in holiness.
It used to be that society would do our work for us of reaching out to younger generations because it was a social advantage to belong to a religious community of some sort, and that doesn't happen anymore, which I think is actually a very good thing for our religions, because I think that we have now the opportunity to show young people the authenticity of our faith, and that our faith can make a difference in our community.
And oddly enough, I was to compare that, I was reading an article about the death of the family phone. When we grew up, everybody had a phone, and that was like where you would all congregate. You know, people would fight to get on the phone. You'd have to take messages for other people so you'd know who everybody's friends were.
Yeah.
It was one of those places of nexus we could get together. Well, that's kind of disappeared. We're all on our own phones. Religion, one upside of it used to be it was a community thing. You could get together to know people. Right. In an age where everybody is electronic or off in the world, how do you get kind of that sense of community back? I really fear that as a culture, we have become so inwardly looking with our digital media, we've lost almost the ability to understand, hey, a potluck in the church basement can be fun.
This is something that I believe all of us, we are, struggling with. I personally belong to a generation that you just, described, and finding myself as an imam, as a religious leader at the Islamic Center, trying to work with a new generation that is totally different. So That's why we are so lucky at the Islamic Center of San Diego to hire a youth director who is closer to their age and understand their dynamic, their lives, and try to have work with them, to have program, to have a curriculum that meet their needs. Because I totally agree with you that our houses of worship are boring for them. And honestly, we cannot compete with the many unlimited attractions that exist out there. So we kind of like beg our youth to come to the Islamic Center or to the church or to the synagogue. I often have this conversation with my friends, clergy, and all of us, we find ourselves in the same situation. How can we make our faith relevant to the daily lives of our youth? This is a big challenge, and I believe that we as youth, as religious leaders, we need to adapt, to adjust, to understand the world of our youth and try to do something about it.
Yeah. And I think really the thing that we were talking about is serving our community is a big way to reach younger people because they want to make a difference. Yeah. They want to see that faith makes a difference, that it means something. And I think one of the things that perhaps religious communities got used to is just being able to open our doors and people would come flooding in. And what we need to realize is that we need to do things differently. We need to be out in our community. We need to be connecting with people. We need to be addressing the issues that are important to people in their lives today. So in San Diego, there are people who can't afford to live because the housing cost is so high. That's something really important that we need to be involved with. And I think there are projects we can do that not only serve the community, but that we have an opportunity then to use those, whatever service that we're doing, feeding the hungry or whatever, to then reflect theologically on where God was in that situation, because that's where our faith comes in. We don't do these things only to be good, we do them because God sends us to do these things, and that's an important reflection of our faith.
And then you have two competing strains going on. On the one hand, you have people who have kind of fallen out of religious tradition because, as you're saying, there's so many other competitions. You could turn all religions into an app, I suppose, and just download on your phone, but you lose the fact it's always about community. Yeah. In the Catholic Church, I'm a Catholic, communion's a big thing. In the Anglican Church, it's the sense that you come together for something greater than yourself. Yeah. On the other hand, you have wrongful righteousness. There are people who we started talking about who are co-opting their religious traditions for their own advancement of power. In America, there's the Christian identity movement in its various sense, that this is a white Christian nation. Gives you a sense of power to do that. My question is always, who's Christianity? Because once you drill down to it's a Christian nation, not all Christians are the same. Protestants and Catholics have their divides. You have fundamentalists versus progressives. How do you get people engaged without them drifting into the more radical traditions, which have been, unfortunately, very successful at bringing people into their sides in Islam and Christianity, and even in Judaism? There are radical fundamentalist Buddhists out there. Look at the problems in Myanmar.
Yeah. And as a representative of the Christian religion, which is the one that has the most power in this nation, I would say that it is important for us as Christians to address our own issues of power. We need to live more deeply into our own tradition, as I said. But one of the priorities that our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, has said is a priority for our whole church is racial, ethnic, and religious reconciliation. And so in our diocese, we are doing a project where people can explore their own history with those issues, do some reading, watch some videos, be challenged on their own history with those issues. And I think that is important for us as religious leaders to lead people into learning about their own power, their own uses of power, their own attitudes, and be challenged by what other people experience.
I think it's very challenging. It's a very challenging time to be a minority in America, whether it's a racial minority or a religious minority, sexual identity. All of these subgroups are suffering under this real haze of supremacy, of a sense that there is a supreme group, there is a supreme way of thinking, of worshiping, of dressing, of acting, of loving, and it becomes a very challenging thing in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, to want to stand up and say, this is my America, this is my San Diego, as much as it is yours and as much as it is yours. And I am American. I'm a Jewish American. I'm a rabbi. I have a community. I have a family. And my faith informs how I live, but it does not separate me from the circumstances of my birth and the community in which I've thrived. And there can be no tolerance for that kind of approach to any subgroup of Americans, because unless you are part of an indigenous community born here on this land, we've all come from somewhere. And that is what ties us together in ways that I think are really important to share and not to divide.
The work you're all doing is critically important to be able to try to develop that. I hope a program like this has a chance to get a bigger platform to go out, but there's some line from the New Testament, I believe, about candle under a bushel basket. Got to rip that bushel basket off and let that candle shine brightly, because we need faith to have faith. And the work you're doing is critically important. I greatly appreciate you joining us tonight and sharing that with us all, and I look forward to continuing our conversation in the future. Thank you very much, and let's all remember to keep it civil.
Absolutely.
Thank you.